Guys, so let's get into chapter 3 here. Again, I may be a little bit in and out with this video because I've got, my email set up and I've got my group Meet, my Google Meet on in case I have any students that have any questions. But I wanted to take this time also to go ahead and record chapter 3 because I know some of you guys are reading along with me. So, chapter 3 is when we get into the really cool, nerdy stuff. So, but I've talked to you guys about Proustian metaphor before, and I may do a standalone video where I'm just talking about what that means and my understanding of it, the way that it was taught to me. But what you mainly need to know is that when we shift from knowing something to be true, but that understanding of that thing to be true changes as we either gain knowledge about the outside world or about knowledge about ourselves, then there is still a kernel of truth to that thing. So let me give you a for instance. For instance, I understand the idea of a rose blossoming and opening and creating meaning in that way. And my first encounter with the idea of the metaphor of the rose blooming was through Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, just like you guys probably did with 9th grade, right? They talk about the idea of a rose blossoming and love blossoming and how the rose is symbolic of love because of all of the interconnections therein. Like it's beautiful and it needs to be tended and it is something that can grow wild, and sometimes roses are contained, like love can be contained. It's got thorns that can hurt you, so on and so forth, right? So the more that I understood this metaphor of the rose being something that represented love, the more it became concrete for me. Now, fast forward, 10 or 15 years later, I'm in college and I start to do all of this research about the idea of symbols having multiple meanings in the way that we neurologically understand them. So we associate the meanings of objects with emotional connections. So, for example, if I have an emotional connection to my grandmother, and my grandmother always wore rose perfume, then my understanding of a rose being associated with love is going to be very different than your understanding of a rose being associated with love because it's something that your boyfriend gave you, right? Is there still a kernel of understanding there between the two of us? Absolutely. And that's kind of the basis of Ferdinand de Saussure's understandings of semiotics, right? So our understanding of language and word and object creates a sign. And that sign is the object itself. But there's also the signifier that's attached to it. And the signifier is what you've been taught that means, right? So maybe you've ever been taught like the different meanings of roses, like red rose means romance, yellow rose means friendship, white rose means purity, whatever it is, right? And then there's also the signifiers that are all of the emotional connections therein. So for example, my grandmother who wore rose perfume, and my husband who, will buy me roses on my anniversary, and at Romeo and Juliet, right? So those are also signifiers. So there's emotional signifiers and knowledge-based signifiers. And then together those things create what Saussure calls the signified, right? And the signified can be the same and different for everybody, okay? So if I say the word love, that sound comes out of my mouth and goes into your ear in some Byzantine conduit and lands in your brain, and you make all of these free associations with it. And love to you can have multiple meanings, and one of those multiple meanings has to do with the idea of this particular flower, right? Okay. Now, fast forward later, now I'm starting to teach Romeo and Juliet. Now I'm starting to look more into the text itself, and I'm starting to understand the cyclic nature of a play. So Romeo and Juliet, just like Hamlet, just like any Shakespearean play, it has within it the existential crises of performance. With a play, something is down and done and dead on paper, right? So like language on paper, and then you make the construct in your brain, right? And you create the picture in your brain. but then also a play comes from paper and is performed in front of you. And the actors go through this performative act of all of these emotions that are real but not real in front of you. And they do the play and then they stop acting. And then they're resurrected again, and they're resurrected again, right? So I'm starting to understand that the play Romeo and Juliet itself is a rose that blossoms and opens and conveys meaning and then closes and dies again, and so on and so forth. So you have, Wittgenstein, again, you don't need to know who he is, but he's another linguistic philosopher. Wittgenstein talked about the idea of, there is never-ending mirrored meaning, which is why I think it's very important that when you have a book that you find is full of these little treasures, that you therefore reread and reread and reread as you gain more knowledge about the world around you and your own understanding of yourself. Who cares, Kohanim? It's important because in this chapter, we have Gatsby who creates himself out of the Platonic conception. Now, we talked about Plato before. Remember, we've talked about Aristotle, we've talked about Plato, and we've talked about Socrates. The big thing with Plato that I wanted you to remember, because it's kind of an easy thing to remember, is the idea of the Plato's allegory of the cave, and that is moving yourself out of the cave of ignorance and how it's not fun, but we kind of have to do it, otherwise we're easily exploited, and we live in a land of ignorance and unhappiness, right? So, Gatsby views his Platonic conception, that's his perfect self, his transcendent, enlightened space, and he creates this image, and then he projects himself into it. So imagine for a moment that the Instagram version of you, the always happy, the always social, the always filtered, the always perfect version of you, imagine for a moment if you could actually become that. Because his name isn't actually Gatsby. His name is Gats. He tacked the word be, as in to be, as in I am or I will be, onto the end of it. Because for him, he is projecting himself into this image of himself that is not real. He is being the most Gats he can possibly be. This is what you don't get when you watch a movie or you schmoop or you spark note and you don't actually read the book. You miss these really cool, interesting aspects. And one of the really cool, interesting aspects of this book is the fact that he creates for himself a persona that is perfect. But I want you to imagine for a moment, if you are perfect all the time, are you real, first of all? And more importantly, can you sustain it? So Plato talks about this, and remember, it's difficult for us to separate what Plato said from what Socrates said. But Plato talks about this idea of forms. And forms are the perfect thing. Right? So like if you could imagine for a moment like the perfect horse, whatever the perfect horse looks like to you. All right? Now, imagine that we're able to actually create that perfect horse. Okay? How long is it going to last before it gets its coat dirty, or it nicks a hoof, or it gets some burrs in its coat? Because the minute that happens, the moment that happens, it's no longer the Platonic form of a horse. It's the same thing with Gatsby. It's, if you can imagine for a moment, a moth going towards a light. The moth sees the light and thinks that that is the heavens. And it goes towards the light. But in order to go towards it, it has to constantly beat its wings to stay in place near it. And then there's all these other aspects of danger. The light could kill it. The light could blind it. It could never leave that light and end up starving itself to death. And that's what we see with Gatsby. We start this entire chapter with this description of this never-ending party, right? And so the line is, Every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruitier in New York. Every Monday, those same oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of pulpless halves. That's what Jay is. Jay Gatsby, if he keeps going at this rate of constantly partying and constantly being the platonic conception of himself, in the end is going to be a pulpless half. Just like you feel after you've taken like 3 tests in a row and you've done the very best you can and you've studied all you can. That feeling of being completely and totally emotionally drained, that is what Fitzgerald is arguing is this lifestyle. This lifestyle of the bourgeoisie where they are constantly partying and everything is happy and gay and meaningless and like just loud all the time. Just, you know, again, go look at the actual Baz Luhrmann version of Gatsby where it's like everything's over the top. If you do that endlessly, then you are not going to have anything left for you, you know? So that is what we see here in this particular chapter. So for AP Lit and AP Lang kids, if you really want to get into this stuff, I am obsessed with Jacques Derrida. Like, Jacques Derrida is my boyfriend. I love him. Obsessed with him. Obsessed with difference. The idea of difference, which is actually spelled difference, but it's French and it's difference and it's differ and differ. Anyway. So Jacques Derrida, Wittgenstein, which is spelled with a double W, so Wittgenstein, and then Ferdinand de Saussure. Okay, so I think 2 French philosophers, and I don't know, was Wittgenstein German? He might be German. Anyway, check them out, because what they talk about language and meaning and neurological construction of metaphor and the echo mirror image of metaphor, it's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Okay, I'm going to stop the video and then check and make sure that this is filming correctly, and I'll be right back.
Okay, so I'm waiting for the other camera to upload all of the video onto my movie maker. So while it's doing that, I figured I'd use a little bit of time on my cell phone memory to keep going and just sort of, I guess, trade off back and forth between the two of them. So yeah, so Wittgenstein, and again, I don't remember off the top of my head, maybe German. Okay, so we go past this opening scene and then we move into this weird past present verb use, right? So we start off in the present tense, again implying that this party life is like never ending, and it's on page 40 for me. So it says, by 7 o'clock the orchestra has arrived. And now normally if I had you guys in front of me, I would have you go through and circle all of the verbs. So here are the verbs. You can go ahead and circle them if you want. So has arrived, have come in, now are dressing, are gaudy, is in, is alive, is playing, spilled, tipped out, change, dissolve, are, become, glide, seizes, is, has. So moving on from page 40 to page 41, we go, the party has begun. And then we switch immediately into present tense. So I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby, so on and so forth, people were not invited. They were introduced. I had been actually invited, so on and so forth, right? So when we go from this present tense to past perfect, and then back to this present perfect, right? That verb shift is actually a form of the Proustian metaphor. So it's the idea of echoing outwards in time. And in this instance, we are present with Nick Carraway, and then we slip into this dreamlike state, and then we slip back into Nick Carraway again, okay? So you'll also hear a little bit more about, not hear a little bit more, but you'll see what's called synesthesia, and that is where the metaphor is kind of mixed, but mixed in a purposeful way, like not inappropriately mixed metaphor, but like purposefully mixed. So for example, at the bottom of page 40, it says, the lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music. So yellow is a visual thing, and then cocktail music is something that we listen to. So it's the blending of both sight and sound. And actually, interestingly enough, this is a medical, neurological thing that some people have. And I have 2 friends that have it, oddly enough. Their synesthesia is a little bit different though. So I have one friend that sees like music waves, like she's able to see like music has a certain like tint to it, like a color to it. And then I have another friend who actually smells, like when she hears certain music. She had a traumatic brain injury, and so she sometimes gets like contricute, like she gets crossed, but she sometimes smells music in a certain way, and like certain music actually has like a smell and a taste in her mouth, which is interesting. But anyway, so it's called synesthesia, and again, it's supposed to lead us into this like dream-like state of this never-ending party world. So the notes that I have about the Proustian metaphor on pages 40 and 41 is that it's past, but it's perpetual, meaning that it's the past, but it's this cycle of ever-opening metaphor to imply tradition and state. And this is what they always have done and will continue to do in perpetuity unless something happens, right? So we've had the inciting incident. We're into the rising action at this point where we're focusing down, like almost like you can imagine a camera like focusing down on Gatsby. That's what we're focusing on. There is a moment in which, and this will become very important for the last page, which is probably going to be like 3 videos long. There's a moment on page 42 where Caraway notes how many Englishmen are at the party and how the Englishmen seem to be talking to the American stockbrokers and Wall Street traders, and they are almost like sucking up to them a little bit. So the reason that that's important is that there is this idea in America that, you know, we're a new thing, right? We're this democracy, this democratic experiment, and like we're supposed to make things better. But Great Britain, with its monarchy, its traditional monarchy, things were more smooth there, right? And like there's an old saying, and I'm gonna get it wrong and my dad's gonna yell at me as soon as he sees this video. Was it Stalin made the trains run on time? It's either Stalin or Mussolini. It's some terrible, you know, like horrible dictator. They're horrible and they do horrible things, but they do run an efficient, you know, economy. They do run an efficient civilization, and the reason that they run an efficient civilization is because everyone's freaking scared of them, right? So with a monarchy, like the trains run on time and like everything runs a little bit more smoothly, and there's, you know, this gigantic economic disparity, but you know, at least they know what they're doing, right? So there is the idea in this particular scene at the top of page 42. I was immediately struck by the number of young Englishmen dotted about, all well-dressed, all looking a little hungry, and all talking in low, earnest voices to solid, prosperous Americans. I was sure that they were selling something, bonds or insurance or automobiles. They were at least agonizingly aware of the easy money and the vicinity, and convinced that it was theirs for a few words and the right key. So there's this throwback to these ideas that like English people just in general have more knowledge or more understanding either of money or of government or whatever it is, and so we sort of put them on the pedestal. It's almost like if you've ever heard someone speak in an English accent, we as Americans automatically sort of feel that they're smart. Right? If you hear someone talk like this, you're like, oh, well, I'm going to pay attention right now, right? So we automatically sort of assume that, and it's not necessarily true. So, okay, so again, this is going to be a longer one, so I'm going to stop the video here and go ahead and end this as part 1, and then we'll move into the really important, like, Gatsby making himself into Gatsby kind of thing, and then Jordan being awful, par usual, because she's awful. So I'm going to stop it here, and then I'll talk to you guys in a minute.